By the 7th week, Jenny's quiet generosity had grown too large to stay unnoticed. The boy continued his silent ritual, always early, always alone, always hungry in the same respectful way. And Jenny never missed a morning. Her co-workers had stopped commenting. Most of them had grown used to it, treating it as another part of the diner's odd rhythm, like the flickering neon in the window or the coffee machine that rattled when it refilled. But kindness, when persistent and without permission, has a way of upsetting systems built to forget the invisible. It was a Thursday when everything shifted. The new district manager from the corporate office arrived unannounced. He wore polished shoes, a navy tie with a pinstripe suit, and held a thin leather clipboard in one hand and a disposable inspection checklist in the other. His name was Mr. Cullen. He walked through the narrow diner like a surveyor marking a field, measuring booth distance, noting the syrup drips on menus, asking clipped questions about freezer maintenance and receipt protocols. Jenny kept her head down and worked the counter, eyes occasionally drifting toward the corner booth where the boy sat with his book and a plate of eggs she'd placed moments earlier. Cullen noticed him. "Is that a paying customer?" he asked without looking at Jenny. She hesitated. "He's a regular." Cullen raised an eyebrow, turning toward her. "I asked if he paid for that food." Jenny didn't answer. Not directly. She returned to refilling the coffee of a silent, older couple by the window. It wasn't defiance. Just fatigue, and understanding that answering with the truth might do more harm than letting the silence speak. But silence wasn't a language Cullen appreciated. He stepped behind the counter without invitation, checked the printed order slips, and matched them with the register. The plate at the boys' table wasn't listed. He wrote something down quickly. His tone, when he spoke again, was colder. "I'll need to speak to you in the office." Jenny untied her apron, folded it neatly, and followed him through the swinging door at the back. Inside, next to the dry storage and a leaking box of pancake mix, Cullen stood beside a clipboard on a metal shelf. "This isn't a soup kitchen," he said without emotion. "You can't just give food away because you feel bad for someone." Jenny didn't argue. She watched the drop fall from the pancake box to the concrete floor. "You've worked here how long?" he asked. 3 years. "And how long has this been going on?" Jenny didn't answer. Not to protect herself, but because even she didn't know when the kindness had stopped being a moment and become a pattern. Cullen flipped a form around. "I'm writing you up for theft of product and violation of policy. Continued behavior like this can result in termination." Jenny took the clipboard and signed. Not because she agreed, but because she understood what would come next. Cullen handed her the pen again. "Or," he said, "you can resign now and avoid further disciplinary action." She looked at the pen. She thought about the boy sitting outside with syrup on his sleeve and a bookmark tucked into a weathered paperback. Then she looked at her hands. Calloused, dry. The kind of hands people stopped noticing after a while. Slowly, she signed her name and handed the clipboard back. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She left through the back door, carrying nothing but her coat and her silence. The morning air was brittle. The wind had picked up since dawn. Her breath fogged in front of her. She stood beside the dumpster for a few minutes, listening to the hum of the walk-in cooler, the buzz of the old rooftop fan. She wasn't ready to go home yet. Not to the apartment above the pharmacy, not to the empty pictures on the wall. She walked instead, down Maple Street, past the closed movie theater, past the park with the swing set that creaked even when no one was on it. She found herself at the edge of town where the fields began. A line of trees separated the last house from a stretch of land that had once been corn but was now just bare earth, wind-blown and still. She stood there, jacket unzipped, arms crossed, not thinking about the job she had lost, but the boy who would walk out of that diner in 20 minutes and find her gone. He wouldn't cry. She knew that. He would probably just nod at Marlene or Kathy and walk away, shoulders tense again, like they were before the pancakes began. And he would assume, maybe rightly, that kindness doesn't last. The boy didn't know she'd been watching out for him long before the first plate of pancakes. He didn't know she had noticed his backpack, stitched at the corner where the zipper had broken. Didn't know she'd seen the bruises beneath his collar on that third morning, or the way he flinched when someone behind him spoke too loudly. Didn't know that she had once been just as small, just as silent, just as good at staying out of the way. That's why she never asked his name. Not because she didn't care, but because she remembered how names could sometimes feel like burdens. She had once been Jenny, the orphan, Jenny, the girl who cried at lunch, Jenny, who never brought a parent to parent-teacher night. Sometimes, being nameless meant you could breathe without explanation. So instead of asking who he was, she fed him. Quietly. Consistently. And now she was gone. By the time she turned back toward town, her shoes were wet with frost. She didn't know what she would do for work next. But that didn't matter. What stayed with her was not the write-up or the clipboard or even the shame of walking away from something that had once been stable. What stayed with her was the thought of the boy, sitting in the corner booth, looking up when his plate wasn't delivered, and realizing, without anyone needing to say it, that something in the world had changed. And not in his favor. The next morning, Jenny didn't set her alarm. But her eyes opened at the same hour they always had, 6:05 a.m. The apartment above the pharmacy was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tapping of tree branches against the window. She lay still for a long time, staring at the ceiling. The absence of a uniform to put on, of pancakes to flip or coffee to pour, left a hollow in her morning. She dressed anyway. Jeans. A thick sweater. The cold had finally taken hold of the town, crisp enough to turn breath into mist, but not cold enough to bring snow. She pulled her hair into a loose braid and stepped into her worn boots. Outside, the street was nearly empty. The diner's sign flickered in the distance, just barely visible through the morning fog. She didn't go near it. She took the longer route, looping around the school zone, where early buses pulled to the curb with a hiss of brakes. She stood on the corner and watched. At exactly 7:15, the boy arrived. He came from the same direction as always. His backpack looked heavier today. His walk, slower. He didn't look up until he reached the diner, and even then, he only glanced at the door, then at the booth. From the sidewalk across the street, Jenny saw it happen, the slight hesitation, the way his shoulders dropped just slightly, like a balloon losing air. She knew that kind of disappointment. The kind that didn't bring tears. Only weight. Still, he went inside. Jenny didn't follow. She turned and continued walking. There was nothing left for her to do there. Not today. The hours passed slowly. She applied at 2 nearby shops, one in the laundromat and another at a hardware store. Neither needed help. The town was small. Work was sparse. And most openings came from someone dying, retiring, or moving away. She picked up a few groceries, enough to stretch through the week, then returned to her apartment and sat by the window, a mug of tea cooling in her hands. She told herself it was over. She had done what she could. A few weeks of warm breakfasts. A few moments of dignity for a child who had none offered elsewhere. That had to be enough. But that night, as the sun dipped below the grain silos and the church bells rang 6 times in the distance, something happened. A noise. First distant. Then louder. Engines. Vehicles. Jenny stepped to the window. Below, 2 police cruisers rolled slowly down the main street. Behind them, a large black SUV followed, trailed by a line of cars. The convoy came to a full stop in front of Rosie's diner. She leaned forward, squinting to make out the figures exiting the vehicles. A man in uniform stepped out of the SUV, his coat emblazoned with the seal of the state police. 2 local officers flanked him. Behind them came a woman in a formal coat, holding a folder and moving quickly toward the diner. A small crowd had gathered within minutes. Word spread fast in a small town, especially when sirens and flashing lights were involved. Jenny didn't move. She watched from her window as someone taped a sheet of paper to the front door of the diner. It flapped in the wind, drawing glances and murmurs. Then, to her astonishment, the state officer gestured toward the crowd. He began speaking. She couldn't hear him, but the faces of those nearby shifted, confused, then solemn, then something softer. A few people nodded. One woman reached for a tissue. Even from across the street, Jenny could feel the mood shift. And then she saw him. The boy. Standing beside the woman with the folder. Wearing the same coat he always had, his backpack still slung over one shoulder. But now his face was up, not down. His hands were clenched tightly, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a man in army dress blues. Jenny's breath caught in her throat. The woman began reading from a paper. People leaned in to listen. Jenny stepped back from the window, heart pounding. She didn't need to hear the words to understand. Someone had noticed. Someone had traced the routine, the quiet meals, the silent care. Someone had asked who had fed the child no one else had fed. And they had found her. Not through a news story. Not from a viral video. But because sometimes, kindness seeps through cracks even when silence tries to bury it. A few hours later, someone knocked at her door. She opened it slowly. Outside stood the woman from the street. Her coat was buttoned tight. In her hands was a sealed envelope and a clipboard. Miss Millers, the woman asked gently. We'd like to ask you some questions. Jenny didn't answer. Not yet. She looked past her, down to the street, where the boy still stood. He saw her now. His eyes locked on hers. No longer wide with fear or caution. Now, they held something else. Recognition. And trust. The letter was short. Handwritten. Folded with care. Inside it, a single sentence stood out like a lighthouse in fog. You kept my son fed when the world forgot him. You reminded him that people still see him. Beneath that line was a name Jenny didn't recognize at first, Captain Elijah Barrett, U.S. Army, deployed. The envelope had arrived by official courier, handed to her by the woman in the coat, a liaison from a military family assistance unit. She had spoken gently, never pressing. Explained what she could. The boy's name was Caleb. 9 years old. His mother had passed from a brain aneurysm 18 months earlier, sudden, silent. His father was deployed within weeks of the funeral, called back due to personnel shortages. Extended tour. There were no immediate family members able to take the child full-time. Temporary foster placement had failed. Paperwork tangled. Caleb had slipped between systems, shuffled quietly into a low-attention guardianship program meant to monitor until longer-term placement could be arranged. In practice, it meant he lived most of his days unsupervised. The guardian was a cousin's ex-husband who rarely checked in, whose address was just close enough to the school to avoid alarm. There were no daily breakfasts. No security. Until Jenny. Jenny, who had no child of her own. No husband. No car newer than 15 years. No savings. But who had seen him. And fed him. Without asking questions or demanding thanks. For a while, it had been the only warm meal he ate each day. That day, the liaison explained, Caleb had finally spoken, not about the meals, but about her. Her name. Her routine. Her leaving. The boy had returned to the foster coordinator's office that morning and simply said, "She's gone now." The caseworker asked who. Caleb pulled from his bag a napkin with a single name, Jenny. From there, the chain of calls had big asterisk N. The military doesn't always move fast. But when a soldier's child is involved, especially one left unattended, wheels begin to turn. By sundown, Captain Barrett had been granted emergency compassionate leave. His flight was already en route. Jenny's ex, undocumented, unpaid, and nearly erased, had reached across the ocean. Now, she sat in the diner once more. Not as a waitress, but as a guest. The owner had called her after the incident. Not Cullen. He'd been reassigned quietly, removed after a local paper picked up the story, calling his decision morally blind. No, it was the original owner, Rosie herself, now retired and living 3 towns over, who came back the moment she heard. They gave Jenny her job back. She declined. There was a stillness in her now, not bitter, but done. She had given what she could. The story had moved beyond her hands. Caleb sat across from her. This time, with a full plate and no book as armor. He ate slower now. No rush. No fear the food would vanish if he blinked. She poured syrup over his second helping of pancakes. A quiet smile between them replaced weeks of nods. The door opened once more. A tall man stepped inside, his posture rigid, his boots worn smooth at the heel. Captain Barrett. In uniform. His eyes scanned the room until they found Caleb, then locked on Jenny. For a long moment, he said nothing. Instead, he approached the table and reached into his coat. From his breast pocket, he pulled a small velvet box and placed it gently in front of her. Inside, a coin. A challenge coin from his unit, bronze with an eagle crest and inscription beneath it. She read the words later, when she was alone, to those who serve beyond the call. He didn't need to say anything. Everything was already said. The other patrons had risen from their seats. Not out of duty, but respect. Even the grumpiest regular, the one who once muttered about handouts, stood now, cap in hand, looking down at his shoes. Jenny didn't cry. Not there. But something deep within her, something that had been sleeping, stirred. 2 weeks later, she moved out of the apartment above the pharmacy. Not because she needed to leave, but because she had been offered something else. The local elementary school had created a new position, student support liaison, with community funding and a quiet nod from the mayor's office. They called it a pilot role, but everyone knew it was built for her. Not for her resume, which was modest, but for her heart. She accepted. Every morning, she walked the same 3 blocks to the school that she once walked to the diner. She wore no uniform now, just soft sweaters and worn boots. But the children knew her. Caleb sat in the 3rd row of her morning reading group. He raised his hand a little more each week. And sometimes, only when no one else was looking, he saved her a seat at lunch. She never stopped being the girl who once served pancakes to a silent boy in the corner booth. But now, she was more. Because kindness, given quietly, grows roots deep enough to hold others upright. It becomes the bridge between hunger and hope. And though her name never appeared in a headline, and no statue was ever raised, Jenny Miller's legacy stood, not in bronze, but in the warm lights of classrooms, the soft clink of breakfast plates, and in the simple truth passed between child and adult. Kindness without question is enough.